Hello, and a very warm welcome to all of you who are joining us today for this webinar on cultural heritage and well-being, which is organised as part of ECROM's webinar series. For those of us joining for the first time, you can find out more information regarding upcoming webinars on our website. So today we will be focusing on well-being, what it is, in what ways cultural heritage contributes to it, and how looking at what we do through a well-being lens might help us to rethink the ways in which we care for and use heritage. Before I begin, I would like to just start with a short explanation for those of you who don't yet know ECROM. We're an intergovernmental organisation working in the service of 137 member states across the world to promote the conservation of all forms of cultural heritage for all people. Also, just a quick housekeeping note, we've set aside the last part of this webinar for a Q&A session. So please do send your questions in via the Q&A icon that you will see at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We're looking forward to hearing from you. However, in case we don't have time to put all of your questions to the speakers, please do send us an email and we'll get back to you. Please don't use the raise hand button as we won't be able to respond to you during the webinar, so please just the Q&A button. Today, I'm joined by 4 speakers who work in very different areas, from economics, public health, sociology, and cultural heritage conservation. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce them to you now. We have joined by Paul Dalziel, who is Professor of Economics at Lincoln University, New Zealand, and lead author of an open access book on wellbeing economics, the capabilities approach to prosperity, which was published in 2018. Also, we're joined by Edmund Fernandez. Edmund, can you turn your screen on? There you are. Who is a physician specializing in public health and CEO of the CHD Group, which is a global public health organization headquartered in Mangalore, India. We're also joined by Sarah Baker, who is Professor of Cultural Sociology at Griffith University, Australia, where she convenes the Heritage and Wellbeing Research Stream. And finally, Renate Schneider, who is Senior Conservator at the Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia of Mexico, where she specializes in the conservation of sacred heritage in rural and indigenous communities. Hello to you all. Our 4 speakers will be sharing their thoughts on well-being and cultural heritage, each from a very different perspective. But I'd first like to say a couple of words by way of introduction to our topic. Well-being. It's a word we hear quite a lot at the moment. The current crisis, not just with regards to coronavirus, but also concerning the climate, the economy, and now the demonstrations taking place around the world, calling for an end to systemic racism and injustice. This has really sparked a global conversation about what really matters in life, about equality, and about what kind of society we wish to live in and what sort of future we might hope for. Ideally, a more just, more caring, more sustainable one. Right now, though, this seems hard to imagine as the economic situation is set to worsen. Can we afford to be thinking about nice concepts like well-being in such a moment? And what about heritage? Is it relevant? Does it have a role to play in getting us out of this mess, or at least in making it more livable? The events we've witnessed over the past weeks have shown us that heritage is something that we should be taking very seriously, as monuments are toppling and long overdue discussions starting regarding whose heritage, whose narrative, and how inclusive and how truthful that narrative is. Likewise, well-being is also a serious matter. So I would first start by asking, sorry, I'm just going to bring it up, this question. What does well-being actually mean? And why should we be taking it seriously? If you Google well-being, chances are you'll come up with images like this. Or perhaps something like this. Well-being certainly sells. Apparently it's something you can drink. Maybe you can even rub it on. More seriously though, it seems to be something to do with connecting with each other, with other people, being social, being healthy, also our mental health. Well-being is in fact a wide-ranging concept that encompasses the many diverse factors that contribute to living a healthy and happy and sustainable life. It covers everything from, whoops, I'm trying to get myself out of the way there. It covers everything from the basic requirements for survival to living lives of value in which people can reach their full potential. There's a tendency to consider well-being as a luxury, something to consider after the essentials of supporting human life are in place. I argue it is not. It's worth noting that well-being is mentioned within the national constitutions of no fewer than 114 countries, shown here. I think you can see from this that the notion of delivering well-being is certainly not exclusive to Western countries or those with developing economies. Put simply, well-being is not a luxury for the rich. It's also cited in quite a number of international conventions, starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Well-being is at the same time about the individual and the collective. It's about how we as individuals feel about our lives, our satisfaction, happiness even. And it's about our collective well-being in terms of our human society. I think we've been reminded very much at the moment that we're social animals. We need each other for our well-being. And right now, we're painfully aware how enforced distance from each other is having a profound effect on us, and we're missing each other. In this time of crisis, we're being forced to confront what we think of as progress. Many of us are coming to the realization that the current models for development are not equitable and not sustainable. For a long time, major thinkers and economists have been arguing that we need a different one based on well-being rather than GDP. And it may be that these ideas are gaining greater traction with governments, as we will hear from one of our speakers shortly. If well-being is for everybody, it should also be intergenerational. Well-being and a sustainable development are like two faces of the same coin. You can't have well-being without sustainable development. And similarly, well-being is the end goal of sustainable development. Living a life of value is intrinsically connected to our sense of self, as individuals, as communities, as a society, and thus in turn is strongly connected to our culture and heritage. If heritage in all its diversity, and here I'm not just talking about monuments and museums, I'm talking about heritage in its widest sense, has a role to play, and then really I think we should be asking ourselves, if that's the case, what must we be doing so that it can do more? This requires us to think closely about heritage, what it is, why it's important, to whom, and how it can promote equity and well-being. And I think it's interesting that in this moment, when we are reappraising the value of caring in society, perhaps too, we should also be reappraising the value of caring for heritage. Now, I'd like to bring in our four panelists so that they can each give you their thoughts on well-being from the perspective of the area in which they work. So first, I'd like to turn to Paul. Paul, if you can, there you are, thank you. Paul, you're an economist who's written a book about well-being and economics, and I think you're best placed to give us more of an insight into what exactly we mean by well-being. And so I'm hoping you can tell us from an economic perspective, what is well-being and where does culture fit in? And why should governments be taking it more seriously, even now?
Thank you very much, Alison. And I'm delighted to be part of the webinar. There's a lot of talk, as Alison has just explained, about well-being and the role that it plays in economic policy, beginning with that famous report by Joseph Stiglitz, Amartya Sen, and Jean-Paul Fitoussi about why GDP is not sufficient and we need to go beyond GDP to think about wider measures of well-being. And countries like my own, New Zealand, have now begun to implement well-being policies into their core economic policies. My presentation will focus on these 5 elements. I'm going to look briefly at what is well-being. I'm going to look briefly at what private and public sectors actors can do to create and sustain well-being. I'm going to look at the way capitals, the wealth of a country, provides services that people draw on to sustain their well-being. I'll give a couple of examples where New Zealand is trying to implement well-being into its core economic policy. And then I'll finish with a simple diagram that brings those elements together with a further page of reading for those who look at these PowerPoints afterwards. So beginning with what is well-being, Alison has already mentioned the influence of Amartya Sen's approach to well-being, which is described as the capabilities approach, which has become very influential because it focuses on lives being lived. And in this way, it allows for enormous cultural diversity in people's values that might influence the way people come to well-being. So this is a very famous quotation from his 1990 book, Development as Freedom, in which he explained that the basic building block of authentic development is expanding the freedoms of people, paying particular attention to the expansion of the capabilities of persons to lead the kinds of lives they value and have reason to value. I've just heard that the PowerPoint is off, so let me escape from that and try again. And is that sharing the screen? So I am explaining that Amartya Sen has approached this approach, and I am completely lost now. So can I see Rom people put up the slides and I will speak to that? So let me speak in person and let's see what happens in the background. So there are many examples where countries have produced frameworks for consulting with their citizens to measure well-being. So the Germans have come up with a well-being framework in which they identify 12 important areas that define well-being, living well in Germany. So they include examples like health, like education, like a strong economy, like global citizenship, like a good balance between rural towns and communities and urban towns and communities. And this has become the pattern that people are using for understanding well-being in a policy framework. Another good example is the OECD. So the OECD has created a framework of 11 well-being dimensions, which produces an overview of statistical indicators explaining how people value and monitor well-being in a policy framework. If we turn now to slide 9, slide 9 goes beyond the question, what is well-being, and asks the question of who is producing the well-being. So well-being is not delivered on a plate. Well-being is created by people taking actions. So next slide and then just click the buttons as we go through. Well-being starts with persons. Persons making choices. Persons form households and families. The households and families become the basis for wider institutions of civil society. The civil society is the place where the market economy has local expression, and this is an essential part of well-being. This is the private sector moving now into the public sector. Local government supports well-being, the nation state supports well-being, and the global institutions coming together to promote the common good, including institutions like ICCROM, are contributing to the ability of people to create private-public partnerships for well-being. So to the next slide, underpinning the actions of people to promote well-being are the wealth of a country. So the OECD, for example, on the next slide, has a framework in which there are 4 well-beings, 4 capital stocks contributing to well-being. So we have human capital, education and health. We have social capital, the institutions and the norms that people use to communicate with each other. We have natural capital, the environment, and we have economic capital, the physical infrastructure and the like. In my own work, I have thought of 3 other types of capital, and these are on the next slide. The first one is, going backwards, is diplomatic capital at the end of that bar at the bottom of the slide. So diplomatic capital are the institutions we create to promote collaboration on a global scale, like ICCROM. We have knowledge capital as another one. This is referring to the new knowledge that we create and use to sustain well-being through science, through research, through community engagement. And then cultural capital. Cultural capital is the major focus of ICCROM. It provides people with services that they use to sustain well-being, passing on cultural heritage, for example, within households. So click, 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 click to the next slide. A couple of examples from New Zealand. Click, click, click. New Zealand has introduced a well-being budget. We're the first country to incorporate well-being policy into our core economic policy, and it draws heavily on that aspect taken by Amartya Sen around people leading lives that they have reason to value. It is underpinned by a living standards framework, drawing on the OECD model, and the key thing from the New Zealand approach is that we have incorporated cultural identity into our measures of current well-being. And this is something that I think is leading the world, this recognition that cultural identity is essential to well-being. And there is ongoing work going at the moment. So if we bring all of these elements together and shift now to slide 21, there is a simple diagram that brings these things together. Keep going, slide 21. Thank you for your patience. Slide 21 is 3 elements to it, and just leave it like that, I think, is fine, because it gives you the idea. At the top of the diagram is the personal and community well-being that we monitor by looking at different indicators gathered into statistical domains of well-being. Things like cultural identity, like health, like housing, like time use. In the middle of the diagram, we recognize the different ways that humans take actions to develop their own well-being. And at the bottom of the diagram, we recognize the importance of reinvesting in capital stocks so that we are able to sustain well-being into the future. Most important amongst those is cultural heritage. If we do not invest in our own cultural heritage, we are unable to create the services provided from our culture to the whole community that people can use to sustain well-being. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll conclude now and invite you to listen to the second member of the panel.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. Okay, so now we're going to turn to our second speaker. And for many people, well-being is often connected with, or typically connected with, health, and in particular mental health. And in this regard, I'd like to turn to Edmund, who will be talking to us about his work with communities and the delivery of public health care. Edmund, if you can switch your screen on.
I mean, it's been stopped by the host, so I need the host to start.
There you are. Great. Good. Edmund, many might think that for someone in your situation, culture is not at all relevant. So I'm really looking forward to what you have to say about this and about the work that you've been doing with communities concerning public health. Thank you, Edmund.
Before I begin, let me extend my heartfelt thanks to Rohit and Alison for having me here today with ICCROM and the collective attendees. I bring greetings from CHD Group, which is a public health organization headquartered in India. I also bring greetings from the land, which is an ancient civilization filled with diverse cultural heritage, blessed with rich beauty, as diverse as a human mind can imagine. For those of you who have been to India, your experience should speak for it. For those of you who have not, we are here to host you. Before I begin, I would like to invoke a special quotation which we usually remember and practice in medicine. Whenever a patient comes to our corridors, to the clinic, every patient provides us with two questions. What can you do for him or her? And the second question is, what can you learn from him or her? While the first question, what can you do for him, is based more on curative and preventive goals of medicine, the second question, what can you learn from the patient, is built around social, cultural, racial, commercial determinants of healthcare. This is where culture and heritage converges to influence and amplify the notion of public healthcare. Having said this, I would like to walk you all through 4 different case studies which we have come across, which we implement as an organization, working with governments, with United Nations agencies, and with corporates under the social responsibility and sustainable interpretations. So let me start with a case study of open defecation. So India is a diverse land, a land where you can see multiple riches, and a land which also exposes you to elements of poverty. But what I'm going to tell you about open defecation has no connection with either of it. So this is about a community which engaged in open defecation across the banks of the seashore. The mission to reduce and stop open defecation has been a conversation that hovers around every government table, around every policy dialogue. But this has been a community which has been defecating in the open across the banks of the seashore for years and years, centuries and centuries now. So today in the 21st century, wise men and women belonging to government departments, donor agencies, decided saying that, hey, you know what? Open defecation is a problem. So what happens back after that? We've decided to build, you build toilets for each of these communities, and then suddenly you realize that, oops, the community is not using them. Donors and everyone were like perplexed, saying that what went wrong? We've constructed toilets. We've told these guys saying that, okay, start using toilets now. But what we didn't realize is we didn't go back into the cultural dimensions of what made them who they were. So after probing further into the behavioral aspect of it, we realized that the communities had this mindset that if we are going to defecate in a newly created toilet, we are going to suffer from claustrophobia. And what makes the nature's call more meaningful for them was that you go to the seashore, the breeze of the seashore, that is how they would address nature's call. So what I'm trying to tell you all here today is, on one hand, you have good intentions. On second hand, you have deeply woven cultural behaviors and attitudes. On the other hand, what you need to propel this further is the need for corrective behavior change as to why do you really need to use a toilet. So that's one story. Coming to a second story is of a borewell. All of us know what's a borewell. So we had this in a village where women folks would walk for miles together to fetch water. And one fine day, the government decided that instead of making them walk for miles, why don't we really just build a borewell in the center of the town? This makes it accessible. They don't have to walk for miles. It saves time. So when the day of inauguration came up, what happened is you had all these women folks gathering with sticks to like literally intimidate or hit the officials. Question is, what happened? Why? Every intention that was laid out here was good. On probing this, the analysis found was that women folks walking for miles were comfortable. They were in their comfort zones because they would get to talk to their friends, talk about the entire day's work, fetch water, and then walk back, understand how life goes on for each other. And by putting a borewell in the middle of the town, you just directly cut off their time involved for walking, socializing, and also interacting with friends. This brings us to the social determinants of health. Now, what we at CHD do is we also run mobile healthcare units for companies, for governments, and we try to reduce the burden of disease, thereby achieving sustainable development goals and bettering indicators. So a health team, which is already formed, goes to X, Y, and Z locations to treat patients, to engage in counseling, and to also engage in preventive care. But it doesn't end there. The model of well-being culture is too deeply woven. So there's no point like treating patients without really removing the factors which make them sick in the first place. So what we then do is we engage in community development, we engage in social development, we engage in economic development, thereby trying to build community and society as a whole. So to all the folks involved here in heritage and well-being, this is a beautiful opportunity to converge, to really understand of how we can shape our own health. I mean, I can go on giving lectures to people about shaping health, controlling diabetes, understanding coronavirus in the latest results that are available, or even engaging in a healthy diet. But if as a society surrounded by cultural connotations that is polluted, mired with uncertainties and indifference, with little or no access to healthcare, or the one that is available is not rightly channeled, then we are leaving a heritage that calls for correction, for introspection, for clarity, and for inclusiveness. Remember, healthcare is not stethoscope and pills. CHT has been working with the United Nations in reducing the burden of malnutrition. So what we try to do now is, as an agency, if we are going to the grassroots and telling the mothers, look here, you have a child who's undernourished and needs correction, they're not going to accept us, they're not going to listen to us. So we are building a newer model around faith-based convergence, where we tell religious leaders from churches, temples, mosques, saying that, hey, you know what, you've spoken about religion, you speak about spirituality. Here we need your help to change the destinies of communities by talking about nutrition, by talking about primary healthcare, by talking about preventive healthcare. And this model has really been working so well that the burden of malnutrition has significantly reduced. The acceptance of communities to engage with religious leaders has improved because of the collective, inclusive, social being that we are now catering and targeting to. In hospitals, what we look at is a case number, saying that, okay, this patient, this ward. But what we all as well-being people really need to do is to look at individuals as a human being, as a person, not just physiologically or pathologically, but also politically, socially, economically. With this, I think I would like to conclude. And I mean, you can ask any question you want. You can reach out to me whenever you want. Over to Alison.
Thank you very much indeed, Ed. Now, I'd like to turn to Sarah, our third speaker, who today will be talking to us about the benefits of people getting involved in community-run cultural heritage initiatives as volunteers and how this can contribute to well-being. Sarah, if you can switch your screen on, just there you are, sorry. Great. Sarah, I'm keen to hear from you about these community initiatives and how getting directly involved in caring for heritage can be good for people too. Thank you, Sarah.
Good to be with you all. If we could go to my slides, please. Hello, I'm Professor Sarah Baker from Griffith University, and in the Heritage and Wellbeing Research stream of the Griffith Centre for Social and Cultural Research, which is a stream I co-convene with the rock art specialist Professor Paul Tayson, we approach wellbeing as multifaceted. So we recognise the economic, the physical, the psychological and so on factors. But in the context of heritage, we also emphasise the extent that a positive sense of cultural wellness is connected to the strength of connection to cultural identity. And heritage is one of the things that underpin cultural identity. Positive interactions with heritage can contribute to feelings of well-being. But we also recognise that the experience of heritage is not always positive and can also negatively impact well-being. So today, I want to think about well-being in the context of the community heritage sector, and specifically in relation to community museums, archives and halls of fame that collect, preserve and curate popular music's material past. In the picture here on the slide, we see Helen, the owner-curator of New Zealand's Taranaki Country Music Hall of Fame, country music forming her cultural identity. She's singing Teen Angel and is backed by a wall of country music memorabilia. Helen was one of 125 community heritage practitioners I interviewed from across 23 institutions in 10 countries between 2010 and 2015. And these interviews revealed 4 dimensions of well-being in these places, and I'm going to turn to these now. The image on this slide shows a volunteer from Pop Museum in the Czech Republic, holding an X-ray pressed record from that museum's collection. Many of the museums and archives I studied were founded because the well-being of objects was seen to be at risk. And this is captured by the 2 extracts here on the slide. Ray indicates that objects of popular music's material past were in danger of not being appropriately cared for, that its value wouldn't be recognised, and that these objects would become waste and end up on the dump heap. The volunteers in these museums and archives saw it as their mission to create a space where these objects would be recognised as treasure, as the founder of the Icelandic archive put it, and looked after with love, their wellness restored by their being recognised as heritage rather than as ephemera of a throwaway cultural form. The well-being of volunteers is enhanced through the opportunity to ensure the well-being of objects. There is a thrill in the proximity to objects that heritage volunteering enables. Volunteers described a sense of wonderment they felt, being able to engage so closely with materials that have so much meaning to their sense of self, their cultural identity. For a country music fan, for example, volunteering at a country music museum provides an opportunity to deepen one's connection to the genre and to work closely with artefacts that once belonged to artists that they had been fan of for many, many years. In the second interview extract on the slide, though, we can see that well-being can also be reduced when access to the collection is no longer possible. Bart's story here highlights the sense of loss that comes from being separated from the objects and preservation projects that volunteers care deeply about. But as Mel observes in the first extract on the slide, the well-being of volunteers is about more than their connection to the objects and the act of preserving popular music's material culture. It also comes from the social aspects of heritage volunteering, engaging with others who share your cultural identity. Mel talks about Rick and Jim, and they're pictured here sorting through a photograph collection. As the collections manager, Mel is very attentive to the need for accuracy in the archival record. But he also understands the archive as serving an important social therapy function for volunteers, some who may no longer have the capacity to do the sometimes intricate work involved in archiving. With Rick, Mel finds a solution which serves the cultural aim of the institution, but also promotes the personal well-being of Rick. By working closely with another volunteer, Rick can continue the job of archiving despite his serious illness. For Mel, this is about caring for the well-being of collections and volunteers. The third dimension of well-being in these archives and museums is the well-being of the community of interest. There are a few different levels to this. These places were seen to be contributing to the well-being of their respective music cultures into the future. So, for example, looking after the well-being of objects now was viewed as important for the future development of a music genre and that genre's place in the world, providing musicians with opportunities to do research on artists and learn from history, as Warren from the Sarasota Music Archive put it. Volunteers also described how the well-being of members of the community of interest was enhanced when visiting these places, particularly in the context of family history research. And we have an example of this in the second extract on the slide. Visitors thus enhancing their personal well-being. I didn't interview visitors as part of my research, so these stories of well-being were always relayed by the volunteers. They were usually connected to volunteers' own sense of well-being from having an experience with a visitor that made them feel that their job as a volunteer is worthwhile. But we do get closer to the well-being on offer to a community of interest in the first extract here on the slide, which is from the country musician Daryl McCall, who also happens to contribute as a volunteer to the Heart of Texas Country Music Heritage Museum. For Daryl, the museum is a conduit of memory. The photo is of another of the museum's volunteers, but in it you can see an airplane wing on the wall behind her, which is from the wreck of Randy Hughes's plane. When it crashed, Daryl was supposed to have been on that plane, and he says, and I quote, "Part of that aeroplane is hanging on that wall. It's a strange situation. It's sad, but there's a ton of memories here for me." The depth of Daryl's attachment to the museum and the sense of well-being he feels from being there is linked to the extent to which the museum provides a space for him to recall memories. The museum makes the feelings attached to those memories tangible in the present. These community archives and museums are so important for the well-being of objects, volunteers, and the community of interest. But all three of those dimensions are dependent on the well-being of the institution. And these are places that struggle desperately with their sustainability. Along with my colleague Zelmarie Cantillon, we've defined institutional well-being in the community heritage sector as having three key attributes. Firstly, the vitality of the organisation's social and affective dimensions, which make it a pleasurable and a meaningful place to work and visit. So that one's about being able to contribute to the well-being of volunteers and the community of interest. Secondly, the effectiveness of the organisation's cultural aims, which is reflected in the capacity to collect, preserve, curate, document and/or display history to a high standard. So that one's connected to the well-being of objects and also the future well-being of a community of interest. And finally, the sustainability of the organisation's activities in the short, medium or long term, which encompasses matters of funding and succession planning, for example. And these are obviously at the heart of the well-being of the institution in terms of its viability into the future. So these three attributes are interconnected and mutually informing, but also clearly are intimately intertwined with the other dimensions of well-being. The community heritage sector can make significant contributions to meaningful ageing with the engagement of retired volunteers. They also provide meaningful opportunities for unemployed people and are interesting learning spaces as well for people who are studying heritage and conservation qualifications. But governments need to offer more robust funding opportunities for these places. Not just funding for short-term preservation projects, but funding that can go towards the payments of rent, electricity, water, the financial pressure points that will make or break these institutions. It's time for these places to be better recognised, not just in heritage policies, but in all kinds of cultural policies and social welfare policies. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Sarah. Now, finally, I'll turn to our fourth speaker, Renata, who will be talking to us about her work as a cultural heritage conservator with remote rural communities in Mexico. Renata, I'm really looking forward to hearing about your work, and I was really struck by a comment you made to me before this webinar about how you view preserving cultural heritage as a process of promoting well-being. And this is the bit that I really enjoyed, was that if we see it in these terms, we can guide our work in a better and perhaps even more joyful way. So please, Renata, tell us more.
Hi, thank you, Alison. Can you put on the PowerPoint, please?
Thank you, Alison. First of all, I've said it before, but I want to say it again. I would like to thank you, Valerie Magar, and all the staff in ICROM for the invitation to participate in this webinar. Today, I would like to talk about what conservation and restoration are for me. Above all, a social service, more than a material one. Even more so in countries such as mine, where inequality and poverty are essential factors, reflected both in the daily order and in the institutional one. Distributive justice tends to focus on how certain material goods and opportunities are distributed between individuals and groups. However, for nearly 30 years, perhaps even more, but especially based on the theories of Amartya Sen, the importance of guaranteeing access to goods of a social, cultural, and spiritual nature has been emphasized. In Mexico, there's a long-standing tradition of conservation and restoration in rural villages, where cultural heritage fulfills basic functions of community cohesion and significance. In this type of places, cultural heritage matters, for example, because it triggers activities and meanings that build a group subject during each celebration. It also produces collective knowledge to survive in the world, since the way in which festivities are carried out, conceived as work, shapes nature and the favors that come from it. As I said, celebrations and rituals are work, a collective work for the common good. It's not something productive or contrasted with leisure. It's a way of engaging with others. All these activities are rooted in objects and buildings that serve as tools to develop actions which generate community and individual well-being. The conservation of objects and spaces that allow this manifestation is thus essential as a primary asset of distribution and well-being. It does because it ensures permanence of objects that enable the production of culture itself. The objects are seen as assets or goods, and in fact are called cultural goods in Spanish and in the Mexican secondary laws. But it's important to mention that it's the state, which under Cerro and Gary-Lantz, who has decided that these things are a cultural heritage of the nation. However, each village or group sees them from a total different perspective. And even though it obviously has anchors in the past, it's not primarily identified with it, or by its artistic qualities, much more or less with conventional Catholicism and a lot of them. In this sense, identifying how group decisions are made in each place is essential, and respecting those chains is even more so. It is the state's obligation to allow diversity of cultures, the growth and continuity of each one of them, without forgetting that many times enabling cultural diversity should not overshadow economic and social justice, even if this is beyond the realm of the conservator. For a conservator that works for the state, which is my case, the test will be knowing how to work on each object in such a way that the intervention helps maintain those senses, even when those symbols and activities are changing and not static. Culture is not a thing, and it's not in the items, it's a process. So we will only succeed in some way, sometimes more and sometimes less, when trying to be part of that network of satisfaction and group exchange. Understanding and analyzing at least the mechanism in which objects and buildings are used, if we cannot understand their multiple senses or layers, which is actually impossible, will help us propose more efficient alternatives to preserve them. Obviously, if what matters is the process within the celebration, the object itself could vary or become replaceable. Many times it is, but others, the object or building itself condenses a series of symbols that are difficult to transfer to other objects or buildings. This is a group decision. It's not for the conservator to make. Knowing how to distinguish this is also essential. Another fundamental thing is knowing how to provide necessary tools for preservation and knowing when to step aside. Well, now I'm going to give some examples. I'm going to give 3 examples. The first one is this one that's a school that's San Gregory in a little town of a Pame community called Santa Maria Acapulco. This school represents all the ancestors that we don't remember anymore, but they need an offering, because if not, they're not going to be happy. And it is not that they're going to make you some revenge or something bad to you because you don't remember them, but we care also for the well-being of the ancestors. So people does a collective offering for them, represented in San Gregory. And we treat this skull as if it was another sculpture, and we put it on the inventory and everything, but we had to make some cleaning of ourselves to be able to touch it. Okay. Now I'm going to give 2 examples that show different ranges of the problem I was talking about. The first one is when you do a virtuous intervention, and this is the case also in Santa Maria Acapulco, of the temple got struck by lightning and everything was in fire. People tore down the door and got inside and saved everything they could, but this virgin was very, very high, and it's the main virgin. And everybody says that they saw a bird that flew away from the church. And everybody started saying that the bird was refugee in another church nearby. When we did all the conservation and restoration of the place, and we also had to do a lot of reconstruction, when the temple was reconsecrated, people, we weren't able to see it, but people of the town saw this beautiful bird inside again, and the bird was singing. So the Virgin was happy and the temple had a function again. So that will be on behalf of the well-being of all the community. And the other case is just the contrary. It's I can show this. I am not able to. I'm not allowed to show the images, but it's a sculpture of St. Jane the Baptist in another community, a Cora group, and they have this sculpture that's very deteriorated because it's a sculpture from the 18th century. It should have been very nice, very beautiful, but they submerge it in the river every year because if they don't submerge the image, they won't have good crops. So they were desperate because the sculpture was very, very damaged, and they asked for a solution. We came up through a solution that was putting the image in a very big transparent Tupperware and put it inside the river, but inside the Tupperware. This solution lasted 2 years, but afterwards people thought that it was not doing the good that they needed, and they took it away and then put again the sculpture in the water. They were expecting some type of miracle. We weren't able to give them the miracle, but we all agreed that then the sculpture had to do that function until it disintegrated, and then we will see what to do. And still we don't know what we're going to do because there's still something of a sculpture there. Where these examples are just to show that facing the challenges that heritage conservation involves, it's not simple. And understanding the processes and networks that they cause from economical, social, power or inequality perspectives, or even from the other perspectives, the one that we're trained to, such as technical implementation of a project or damaged material control, are not easy. However, I believe that understanding them more as a process of distributed justice, well-being and satisfaction can guide our work in a better and for sure more joyful way. I think we can make this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Renata. And I'd like to thank once again all of our panelists for their really fascinating presentations. And now, while we've been talking, we've had a number of questions coming in. Due to the limited time, it won't be possible to take them all, but I think I'd like to pose just a few to our speakers. So if our speakers could please now turn their cameras on so we can see you. Great, thank you. Good. We have 10 minutes remaining, so answers briefly, please. And I'm going to start with a question for Paul, which is, and I just got to bring this up now. Okay, Paul, question for you. Can well-being be achieved with the current capitalist economic structure, which depends on technology and cheap labor?
Thanks, Alison. There is well-being being created at the moment, but it's been captured by a relatively small share of the full population. And so the question is, how do we expand well-being so that more people can create lives that they value and have reason to value? Some people say it's by making the current system bigger and stronger. And the well-being movement is arguing, no, we have to rethink within our cultural heritage what role the market economy plays and how more people can access through decent work the resources that they need to create lives that they have reason to value. And cultural heritage is the essential foundation for answering that sort of question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your clear and succinct answer. I think now I'm actually going to turn to Edmund. Ed, to what extent do you see traditional knowledge and cultural traditions helping to improve community health?
I think traditional knowledge needs to be married in terms of an intergenerational solidarity, thereby drawing intersection and influence of cultures, race, and well-being, which amplifies the cause and goals of healthcare. You might be anybody, you might be doing anything under the sun, but if your frame of mind is not physically, mentally, and socially in coherence, the purpose of an existence as a human being would be defeated. So I would like to look at this from a healthcare lens, at the same time from a lens of a social anthropologist who draws inspirations from our surroundings that influence who we are. So what we inherit is often what we transmit as a greater destiny.
Thank you very much indeed, Ed. Now, turning to Sarah. Question for you. In what ways do you think community institutions can help mitigate the long-term effects of the COVID crisis? And what needs to be done to support them beyond money?
Well, I think money is always only a small part of the challenges that these places face. I mean, I say small part, it's one of the major ones, but it's one of the ones that they've suffered with for such a long time that they manage to run on a shoestring budget. They don't necessarily always get to do the things they want to do or need to do, or sometimes they have to move buildings because they can no longer pay the rent where they are. But money is one part of a much wider issue, and I think people is probably the next major concern. These places need people. They always need more volunteers to be assisting them in the tasks of preserving and collecting and archiving and cataloguing, all of those things that come with heritage management. I think one thing that COVID potentially provides due to the unemployment crisis it's creating is more people with some time where they could engage with these sorts of places, develop new skills for a different post-COVID job market. So I think that's one place where promotion of community heritage sector organisations could be important in this post-COVID world.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, finally, Renata, to you. This is an interesting one. And I think that some people watching this might be saying to themselves, why should conservators be bothering about things like well-being? They should be getting on with fixing heritage. Do you think focusing on well-being as a conservator actually detracts from our work? Is it really our job to be focusing on well-being?
Well, thank you, Alison, and thank you for the question. Well, I think that even when interventions are oriented to crisis and disaster managing, we must not forget that what we're seeking at the last is, and as professionals, as institutions, as volunteers, is the well-being of the use and veneration and appreciation, well, knowledge and joy of what we want to rescue. If we don't do it like that, it doesn't have a sense. I believe that we should be aware that we're only a tiny part of that, and that we contribute only in a small way, because our work covers a very broad spectrum, but that possibility is included as well. And I don't believe that works that only focus in one direction, but well-being is clearly a fundamental direction for us.
Thank you very much, Renata. And I must say, I do agree with you. Now, we're getting very, very close to the end of our time here. I've got one question just quickly that maybe Sarah could take. Sarah, if you can, shortly. A question about terminology, I think, really. You know, is it not the case that the term care already conveys more of the immediate meaning and practical strategies with regards to cultural objects than well-being?
Thanks, Alison, and thanks for that question. Care, it was central to all four levels of well-being that I spoke about in my presentation. For the community heritage sector, care of objects, care of other volunteers, care for the institution, care for the broader community of interest. Care really is kind of central to what these places are doing. But I think what we saw from the other presentations today is that there is more to the concept of well-being than care. And so I think it's useful to continue thinking through what well-being gives us in terms of cultural heritage.
Thank you very much indeed. I think what I'd like to do now is I'd like to ask each of our speakers in one sentence, please, give us the take home with regards to well-being from your perspective. So should we start with Ed?
Yeah, sure. So in one line, I think heritage, culture, and well-being should be remembered in integrating it with one word, healthcare.
Thank you, Ed. Okay, Paul.
Well-being comes from effective actions by private individuals, community organisations, and public actions by local and central government, so that in a time of crisis like this, it is essential that governments continue to invest in cultural heritage as a foundation for future well-being.
Thank you, Paul. So well-being is everybody's responsibility, as well as everybody's right. Okay, Sarah. What's your take home?
I think Renata's presentation really drew our attention to the important place of distributive and social justice in thinking about cultural heritage and well-being. And I think I'd add to that cultural justice as being important, that heritage can be used to overcome some cultural injustices in communities.
Yes, I completely agree. And now you, Renata.
Well, I think that collective and cultural understanding, knowledge, and work and respect seen as essential goods for our work. I will say that.
Thank you. Okay, time's up. So I'd like to conclude this webinar, firstly by really thanking all of our speakers who've really kindly given up their time and also got up to be with us at all times of the day and night. So we're very grateful to you and thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank our organising team here at ICCROM who've been working hard behind the scenes to bring these webinars to you. I'd also like to thank, of course, all of you who've joined us today for your interest and for your questions. And just to let you know, the recording of this webinar will soon be made available on the ICCROM website, and also you can find it on our YouTube channel, where you can find also other webinars from this series. You can also get information about our future webinars on our website if you search for ICCROM Lecture Series. And of course, don't forget to check our social media platforms. Thank you for being with us. I hope you'll be with us again soon. And in the meantime, please take care of yourselves, each other, and heritage. Goodbye.